Between 1979 and 1989, poachers killed over 700,000 elephants. It was devastating. In fact, it was so devastating that it prompted the international body known as CITES to list the African elephant as an endangered species, restricting all sales in elephant ivory for the time. Well, the effectiveness actually proved to be somewhat of a demise because 4 years later, international aid organizations thought, oh, well, we've taken care of this problem. So they withdrew their aid for law enforcement. Poaching started to increase. Meanwhile, the economy in China started to boom, and newfound wealth in China was buying ivory to show off how wealthy they've become. It created a perfect storm. Essentially, you were removing law enforcement effectiveness, increasing demand, and poaching started to increase again greatly. I lived in Africa throughout this period. I lived in the most heavily poached area in Africa, seeing this whole thing unfolding. And during the time, I was developing methods to measure DNA and hormones from wildlife feces, their dung, because it's very accessible and it allowed me to ask landscape scale kinds of questions. I realized I could apply this to the poaching problem to be able to perhaps pinpoint where the poaching is, and the results surprised everybody. So how serious is the problem? Now, you see a lot of numbers about this in the literature. There's an elephant killed every 15 seconds, 30,000 elephants killed, 50,000 elephants killed a year, and it's really all over the map. And I wanted to develop a metric that was based on a hard starting point. So I used the amount of ivory that's seized every year to calculate how many elephants were actually being killed, because every country has to report annually to CITES how many seizures they have actually made in their country. So if you then have the simple assumption, well, how much ivory represents a single elephant? And we know that each elephant has on average 2 tusks that each weigh about 5 kilograms. So 10 kilograms of smuggled ivory is equivalent to 1 elephant. But only 10% of smuggled ivory gets seized. So really 1 kilogram of seized ivory is equivalent to 1 elephant. Easy number to use. Well, in 2013, there was over 51,000 kilos of ivory seized worldwide. That means that there were more than 50,000 elephants killed, and there are only 470,000 elephants left in Africa. You don't have to be a mathematician to see how serious of a problem this is. And it's more than just an animal welfare issue. It impacts all kinds of things. This wholesale loss of elephants is creating enormous ecological damage. The elephant is the largest terrestrial animal in the world. It is what we call a keystone species because it eats so much and it transforms its environment. Here's an example. The Central African forests are the second most important forest in the world for carbon capture, and many of those trees that capture the carbon have very large seeds. The only thing that can effectively disperse those seeds are large animals, and the elephant is one of the few. In the last 50 years, we have lost 95% of the forest elephants in Central Africa. So there's nothing to disperse those seeds. And what's happening now is the forest structure is starting to transform. Old trees die, and new ones of the same species don't replace it because their seeds are not being dispersed effectively. And pretty soon, it could have dramatic effects on the world's climate by impacting carbon capture over a very, very large landscape scale. Another place that we see an effect is demography. First, the poaching focused on very large bull elephants because they have the biggest tusks. After a while, we started seeing things like this on the right, where we start seeing whole herds of tuskless elephants. We also know that the elephant has the largest brain of any terrestrial mammal and is exceedingly social. And the social impact of having poaching moving from the big bulls to the matriarchs that guide the troop were devastating, like this orphan animal growing up after its mother was poached. And we start seeing whole herds of elephants where in the family groups, virtually all of their adults, all the adults over 15 years old are dead. And the leadership in the herds are affected. All kinds of social ramifications. Females when they reach their reproductive prime, when their families was poached by the time they were 15, by the time they reach 25, their reproduction is less effective than what is the case for unpoached populations. So it just is very, very far-reaching. It also affects the economy. The tourism trade is essential for the economies of especially the Eastern African countries, but many others as well. And people are starting to be afraid to go to these places because of all the poaching that they may see and the risk to themselves. And then there's a national security issue. Right now, there are a number of terrorist groups that are poaching elephants and other wildlife products to sell that and trade for hard currency, to trade directly for arms and ammunition. So the effect is pretty far-reaching. Now, if you consider we're losing 50,000 elephants a year, there's 470,000 left, the ecological demographic damage that's causing, we really urgently need to stop the killing. It's important to decrease demand worldwide, and that's very effective, that's very important over the long term, but most urgently, if we're losing a ninth of the population a year, we really have to stop the killing, and the best way to do that is to go to the source where the killing is actually occurring. And the other thing that's very nice about that approach is that it stops the ivory right at its source, and it prevents it from entering into transit where it goes to all these different countries and becomes so diffuse and complex and expensive to be able to police. So if you can hit it at the source, you essentially can choke the whole trade, depending on how many different areas are being heavily poached. And that's really what we wanted to know. We wanted to know, where are the major poaching hotspots occurring in Africa, and what can we do about them? And we specifically looked at very large ivory seizures to do this. We looked at ivory seizures that weighed over a half-ton minimum and were worth a minimum of $1 million. And the reason for that is that 70% of all ivory is seized are those large seizures, so that's a lot of what's actually being moved. But also, this has the signature of major transnational organized crime syndicates. And right now, this trade is the 4th largest transnational organized crime in the world. The whole wildlife trade is, and elephants are a big portion of that. So by focusing on these large seizures, it allows us to hone in on where are these big syndicates actually operating. So how do we do that? This is where poop comes into the picture. So there's nothing more accessible from wildlife than their dung. And we developed ways to get DNA from their dung, and we measured a wide variety of complex genetic markers in the dung samples. And then we collected samples from all over Africa, over 1,400 samples, each one from a separate family group, and we developed statistical algorithms that allowed us to use this genetic information to differentiate these elephant populations based on how far apart they were and how long they've been separated. And we're able to do this with very, very high precision. We then developed ways to extract DNA from the ivory by pulverizing it into a fine powder, extracting the DNA, and matching the same genes we measure from the dung to our map, and we could actually pinpoint these ivory seizures with extraordinarily high accuracy. We could get it down to less than 300 kilometers from anywhere in Africa, and when you also know the parks in those areas and how many elephants are there, you can actually narrow it down to the individual park where this is occurring. Now, the last piece of this puzzle from a methodological standpoint is, how do you sample these huge seizures? Some seizures that we sample have over 2,000 tusks in them, and we're not going to analyze all 2,000 tusks. It will go bankrupt, and it'll take too long. So we needed to figure out a way of sampling them in a representative way that kind of cuts down the number of tusks that you get. And the first thing we did was figured out a way to have the countries that seized them develop methods they could easily use, and the first thing was to allow them to remove the pairs, one of the pairs. So each elephant has 2 tusks. If we can figure it out, align them so that you're next to your pair, then you can just take one out and put it away, and then you've cut your seizure in half. And so we developed a simple method measuring the diameter at the base of the tusk, then lining them up from smallest to largest, and then matching them by the gum line. This is where the ivory protrudes from the tissue. Those are highly asymmetric between 2 tusks of the same size. Once you do that, you take every other tusk away, and you've got your seizure cut in half. You don't waste time analyzing data from the same animal twice. The next thing we did was we looked at characteristics of the tusks that essentially suggested that these tusks were in the same place at the same time, and we divided them into those groups and sampled proportionally from each of those groups. So examples are, sometimes tusks are cut into sections, other times they're whole, where the ones that were cut in sections were in one place at the same time, but not the same place that the ones presumably were left whole. Another one is that you see these tusks here are burned at the gum line. When you poach an elephant, they literally cut the face off, and it's got tissue stuck to all of the ivory. And poachers don't want to carry this reeking ivory out that's attracting flies, so they stick it in the fire, and they soften the tissue, and then they scrape it off so it's nice and clean. But there's other groups that don't have the burn marks, and they've got clumps of tissue in them. Two different groups. Again, this guy's nice and neat, cutting off the, burning off the tissue. This guy isn't. And then other times we often see tusks with writing on it. This says 12, which is Swahili for 12. And so dealers will write information on there so they're sure either where it's going, who they were, so they get paid. So by dividing into those groups and then sampling them proportionally so that you end up with 200 tusks, then we have a nice representative seizure we can analyze to see where it came from. When we put all these data together, we were shocked because virtually all of these large seizures over the last decade came from just 2 places. It is extraordinary. 27% of all the large seizures were made up of forest elephants, and by the way, forest and savanna elephants are genetically as different as the lion and the tiger, so they're really virtually separate species. And so all of the forest elephant ivory was coming from an area in central Africa, which is the last remaining stronghold of forest elephants. But the largest percentage of ivory was savanna ivory. 73% of all large seizures were coming from an area in East Africa centered on Tanzania. So let me just show you the data, and let me just show you how to read these maps. Here's a box showing you the area that we're blowing up across each of these maps. The name here is the country that it was seized in the year. Okay, so you can see there were 3 seizures in Hong Kong, 2 in Togo, 1 in Malaysia at these different time periods from 2006 to 2014. The green crosses are where we had those dung reference samples with the genetic information we used to match the genotypes of the ivory to. And the blue circles are where the ivory actually was genetically assigned. And so what you can see here is that in all these cases, except for that one, which I'll return to, it's coming from this area largely in Central Africa, which is the corner between northeast Gabon, northwest Congo, southeast Cameroon, and southwest Central African Republic. That's the last stronghold of elephants in Africa, and again, you can see where they're all coming from. You can also see this orange diamond is where they transited from. This one from Cameroon, this one from Togo, Nigeria, Togo. Now, when we got to this one, this is very different. And in fact, all of these seizures, except for that one, were ones where there was a big shipment of ivory that was seized in a port moving out. This one wasn't. This was the warehouse of a man named Emile Mbuki, who was allegedly one of the largest dealers in West Africa. And they raided his warehouse, and that they found was that he had lots of ivory, and some of it was actually concentrated in these other areas. But there was also this area here in West Africa where there's not that many elephants left that had quite a few of samples. And that was very surprising. And then when we also looked at these other areas, we found that there were some others that also had that same kind of signature. There was some ivory that when they moved it up from the area where it was poached to where it was shipped, they actually were putting in some ivory that he had been collecting over the time. And what's interesting is you get this is kind of a signature suggesting they're related. None of the ivory from Hong Kong has that. So it started to make us see that we've got one big guy, one big area where most of this ivory is coming from, and we have probably a minimum of 2 big dealers, and probably not more than that, moving all this ivory out, and we started to see what they look like. But when you get to the savanna elephants, the story gets really interesting. Now, those orange crosses are the reference dung samples. The boxes is now showing you East Africa. And when you go through this area, and you start to see that they're all concentrated at the very beginning in this area right here. This is Tanzania, and this is Mozambique. This area right here is the Selous ecosystem in Tanzania and the Nyasa game reserve in Mozambique. Together, the Selous-Nyasa ecosystem. It's the largest protected area in Africa, has historically had one of the biggest populations of elephants. Peter Matheson wrote a book about it called Sand Rivers. And you can see in 2006, we have same area popping up over and over and over again back to 2009. This place is a little peculiar, which I'll return to, and then we're back again. And then these two are also a little peculiar, but then you're back again. And then all of a sudden things start to shift. And you start to see that all of a sudden ivory from this area is starting to not show up. and you start to get a concentration over here again, until pretty soon, by the time you get to 2013 and continuing into the current period, there's very little ivory coming out of here, and most of it's now become concentrated here in this place called the Ruaha National Park and the Rungwa Game Reserve to the north. What happened was they poached so many elephants out of the Selous Nyassa area, that whole huge ecosystem, that it was hard to find elephants, and they were so skittish, so they moved to the second biggest population in Africa, in Tanzania, which was Ruaha here. But they never moved out of Tanzania, really. This is extraordinary, because what it suggests is that there are other places in savanna Africa with lots of elephants. Why is it that all of this ivory is coming out of Tanzania? Why hasn't it shifted? And how did they get it all out of there? It has to have implicated high-level government corruption. Just has to. And in fact, there is what we call a corruption index, which law enforcement people use, which is what percentage of the contraband moving out of your country is seized outside your country versus inside your country. If everything's getting out, then you're high in the corruption index because you got a lot of stuff to catch, but you're not catching anything. So something fishy's going on. Tanzania is not in a single one of these seizing countries. High corruption index. The other thing that's very interesting about this, if you look at the transit countries, initially, all the way through 2009, they're all coming out of Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. Poaching in Tanzania, moving out of Tanzania. Well, that's very rare. In every single other case that we have looked at, the ivory is transited out of Africa in a different country. The poachers get the ivory, they move it to another country, and it's a risk reduction strategy. So move the ivory out, so if the poachers get caught, they can't finger the dealer. Well, Tanzania was so brazen in these early periods that they were sending it right out of their country until 2010. Now you see transit out of a different place. So what happened? Well, one of the things that happened in March 2010, at the CITES meeting, the international body that determines what the status of elephants are, or if you are able to sell your stockpiled ivory, Tanzania petitioned to sell their stockpiled ivory on the open market. I presented these data at this meeting, other people presented data, and their petition got denied. And it was very close. What it did was it put all the eyes on them. And when you were moving this much ivory, you look at, well, where did the law enforcement people look at, well, where did this shipment start? Where did it end? Oh, it started in Tanzania. It's going to Hong Kong. We better check this one. So they start to transit out of a different place in here. The other thing that was really interesting about this is this seizure is very different from all these other ones. As you see, it's really widespread, and it's along the whole eastern part of Tanzania. And many of those places don't even have elephants anymore. It looked like it was a stockpile that was seized 6 months after Tanzania's petition to CITES was denied. The interesting thing about this also was that the tusks, it was a lot of small tusks in there. They averaged about 4 kilos, and the shipment was detected in Jomo Kenyatta Airport, which is unusual. Most of it's going out of a port. This was in an airport in Nairobi. And it was all small tusks, and it was caught by detection dogs. The very next seizure at Jomo Kenyatta Airport here, also seized at the airport, but now these tusks were much larger. Instead of being 4 kilos, they're now 12 kilos. So, and instead of being, it was caught by detection dog, these ones looked like they were disguised because the shipment was put in chili peppers and tobacco. So essentially what they tried to do was they looked like they moved their small tusks as a test case, got caught, so then they put in their bigger ones thinking, okay, we know how to get around this, we'll pack it in chili pepper and tobacco, and they got caught again. Well, the very next seizure, this one was huge. Second biggest seizure ever recorded in the world. It was 6 tons of ivory, and a huge seizure. Now, if you look, all of these are transiting out of East Africa. This one, no. So what happened, it looked like, smaller tusks, bigger tusks, and now send out the mother lode, but this time you've got caught twice, so you're not sending that one out of East Africa. No way. This one was moved all the way to West Africa, and it was shipped out of Togo again, and in fact, it was the very same seizure as this one of the forest elephants I showed you earlier. So it's suggested that these traffickers in Tanzania moved it up to West Africa to the same dealer that's moving ivory out of this other hotspot, so we had both hotspots merging together, being shipped out. We've essentially shown that these two big traffickers are linked. Very, very important. And also, we see that that same West African signature seems to be pervasive here. So when we put all this together, we're seeing that the analyses of large ivory seizures have revealed that just 2 hotspots are really being poached. There's just 2 hotspots being massively poached by transnational organized crime syndicates in Africa. They're tightly clustered in general, highly organized, and very slow to change. Now, the nice thing about that is the implications is that if it's slow to change, you can attack those hotspots and actually get the poacher in the act because they're going to keep working that same area. So stopping poaching in those 2 locations could actually crush the largest part of the illegal ivory trade, and it could actually stop the largest portion of the killing that is actually going on in Africa. It will also stop this ivory from moving into transit, where detection becomes less feasible and much more costly to detect and catch. And if we are successful taking out those 2 hotspots, as long as we keep getting new seizures coming into our lab, we can actually detect the emergence of a new hotspot and nip it in the bud before it gets back out of control. So this is a very, very potentially effective way of containing the chaos in this, and hopefully will allow these elephants to really have some peace. Now, I want to end with a kind of a unanticipated thing that happened when this work came out. Obviously, we were very proud when we found this and realized how it all came together. But one of the things that happened that was really startling was that once these results were out, every aid organization, government or non-government, you could imagine, starts pouring aid into Tanzania. It was almost though the more bad you are, the more money you get. But it kind of makes sense. They got a big problem. We know the problem is, so let's solve it. But the problem is they're all still acting independently of each other. And what's happening is there's so much money. There's millions and tens of millions of dollars going into Tanzania right now, all acting independent of one another, so that if one group in there sees something going on and says, hey, wait a minute, they'll go, you don't like it? Get out. We got all this other money here. It's actually enabling them more than what it should be doing, which is holding them accountable. It's not that this aid shouldn't be going to this country. It needs it badly, and it should have it. But if everybody is working independently and fighting one another, competing for money so that they can beef up their organization and work in these areas, show how good they're doing, it really defeats the purpose. And what really needs to happen is that all of these government and non-government aid organizations need to agree that the money that they are giving to Tanzania is conditional on Tanzania doing the right thing, stopping this problem. They've been caught with their hands in the cookie jar. There is no denying it that they are the problem here. And it's not like they can just say the elephants left, which, by the way, is what they did say when people saw that they lost 12,000 elephants in Ruaha National Park over the last year. The government came out and said they left. Well, then our data came out and it showed no way. So if we are able to make aid conditional on it, then they're going to have to do something about it, because that means everything is at stake and there's just too much to it seems to be the best way to overcome the corruption in this situation. And you may say that's impossible, but let me say this. In 1989, when the ivory ban occurred, it was the same kind of problem, and they realized this is so bad that we have no choice but to cooperate, and they did, and it worked. They can do it again, and the time is now. Thank you.